So we're gonna start the recording in 1 second. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. As you guys know, I love true stories. I love the history of certain businesses, and there's always something you can learn from. It doesn't matter which industry or which business, they did something right or wrong, and we can take it and apply it to our own business. So, the book that we're talking about today is called Slaughterhouse. Now, don't confuse it with Slaughterhouse Five, like I did when I first came across it, but it's called Slaughterhouse: Chicago's Union Stockyard and the World It Made. The author, Dominic Pasiga, is with us today, and it's an honor to have you here, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start off with the genesis of this book, or maybe if you want to give us a quick little background summary of what 1865 looked like in Chicago when it comes to maybe refrigeration of meat, meat packing industry, and the revolution that transpired because of it.
Sure. Um, First of all, let me say that the book comes out of some personal experience as well. I worked for the Union Stockyard and Transit Company as a college student, and I was livestock herder, and then later on a security guard. And my family had worked in the packing houses all the way back to 1913 or so.
Wow.
So I had a sort of personal interest in this industry. I grew up right next to it. One of the things that most Chicagoans talk about is the stench from the industry that sort of covered the South Side. Um, but in 1865, this was the suburbs. This was not a part of the city of Chicago. It became a part of the city of Chicago in 1889 with the Great Annexation of 1889. So the stockyards are actually put outside the city limits for one basic reason, uh, so that pollution laws, those kinds of things set up by the city of Chicago would not affect the industry. Most of the packing houses were still in the city in Bridgeport along the river, the South Branch of the Chicago River, until after 1870 or so when they began to move adjacent to the stockyard. From its very beginning, it was a huge attraction for people. They came out in droves to see it being constructed. This would end up being the largest stockyard in the world. Over 1 billion head of livestock were unloaded at Chicago in its 105-year history, well over 1 billion. And twice in the 1920s, over 18 million head of livestock were unloaded in Chicago. In fact, from 1893 to 1933, there were never fewer than 13 million head of livestock, and that was hogs, cattle, sheep, and horses. It was the largest horse market in the country as well. Of course, those were not for slaughter; that was for the selling of work horses and fine horses at Dexter Park. So it really was this huge attraction. And then after 1900, they had the uh, the International Livestock Exposition, and that drew a 500,000 people a year. What most of us don't understand from I think our sensibilities as modern people, right, is that this was such an attraction, that such a tourist attraction. By the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, a 500,000 people a year visited the packing houses to take tours. In fact, into the 1950s, kids were taken there on field trips to see the hogs being slaughtered. I have friends who were permanently marked by seeing the hogs have their throats slit at Armour and Company. So this really was an attraction. We were basically a rural nation, right? Emerging into an industrial nation. Most people knew how to slaughter a hog or even a steer. Grandma had, made chicken soup by, twisting the neck of a chicken and having chicken soup. Um, and so it took a skilled butcher and his assistant something between 8 to 10 hours to slaughter a steer and make it ready for market. At Armour and Company, it took 34 minutes.
Wow.
It took about 6 hours to slaughter a hog on the farm and make it ready for sale. And Armour and Company took 24 minutes. So this was mass production. That it was the modern. It was sort of a slap in the face. It was an epiphanal experience for people. They came to see this in droves, like people used to come to see cars being made. Like people perhaps today would go to, some place where computers are being made, et cetera, Silicon Valley. Um, Chicago was this huge attraction for people, and it brought people, of course, and if you think about the workforce, by World War One, there's almost 50,000 people working in meatpacking in Chicago. If you put the Chicago Union Stockyards in the middle of a circle and sent a diameter across, across it of 3 miles, 1.5 miles on each side, you could actually count more than 35 Roman Catholic churches because of the great massive immigration that took place. Irish, German, Polish, Lithuanian, Slovak, on, along with many Protestant congregations, and also Jewish synagogues. So this really was Chicago in many ways. And I
Holy
think,
smokes, that's fascinating, man. I mean, I'm just thinking about what you just explained, where you would have a factory probably seeing, like you said, a cow or a pig enter 24 minutes later. It's on an assembly line, pretty much like what Henry Ford did with a car,
right,
and it's being packaged and being sold, which probably shocked the hell out of people. So I was just in a state where you were explaining it. I'm like, oh my God, I never even thought about how that was a new thing then, and was like, ooh, let's go watch it. It's crazy.
yeah. Well, in fact, Henry Ford visited the packing houses, and he often said that he had his idea of the assembly line from the disassembly line at Chicago. So, I mean, it's really interesting. Sarah Bernhardt, one of the great actresses of the 19th, early 20th century, visited the stockyards and wrote about it in her memoir. Uh, the children of Russian princes came to see if they could learn something to build this in Russia. Japanese royalty came. Um, every president who ever ran for the United States, up until about Franklin Roosevelt, visited the stockyards, as part of their campaign tour. Mayor Daley, the original Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley, excuse me, um, actually posed in his first election on a horse in the stockyards. He had worked there as a boy himself.
Hmm.
So this was, a very important part of Chicago life, and then it disappeared.
You're a great
It disappeared
storyteller. I
rather
was just
quickly.
entranced, by the way, when you were talking, because um, whenever I was doing a little bit of research, I didn't know, how much of a change up it was. And then I realized, like you said, that it became this natural attraction for, like you said, field trips. I didn't know it was up until 1950, but it doesn't even comprehend in today's society that people would want to go see this.
Right,
So,
right.
Swift and Armour. I know these two individuals play a major role in this, and I believe one was the butcher and the other one was the meat packing. And 1865, the refrigeration and packing it and allowing meat to travel across the country, it was like a new thing at that time. So that created what? Tons of jobs. It also centralized the meat packing world, and it did wonders for Chicago. Is that right?
Right. Well, I mean, when the stockyards opened in 1865, it was primarily a stockyard that shipped livestock east. Most of the livestock was shipped, 3/4 of the livestock were shipped east. About a quarter of them were slaughtered in Chicago for local use. Remember, there's no refrigeration in 1865.
Yep.
By the 1870s, you're getting railroad cars that are refrigerated, and that's when they're perfected by Swift and Armour, and they reach out to the East Coast. Now, butchers on the East Coast, very few people today remember the fact that Manhattan was a major slaughtering center. There was a
Didn't know that.
stockyard in Midtown Manhattan, what they call the meatpacking district still today. Now it's nightclubs and bars, etc., loft buildings. But it was a meatpacking center, and livestock would be shipped from Chicago to Manhattan and then sold again to local butchers, and meat was slaughtered in New York City. Um, Now, what Swift and Armour did was they began to bring chilled beef into these areas. The railroads refused to carry it first, because the railroads made more money on live animals. Live animals are heavier, they charge by the pound. You can only fit about 25 in a rail car. Suddenly, chilled beef, you could put a lot more in a rail car. It
Of
was
course.
lighter because there's no blood, guts, things like that, right? And so it cost less money to ship. So the U.S. railroads said, "No, we're not going to carry this." So Swift made a deal with the Canadian National Railroad that came down through Canada, down into Wisconsin, into Chicago, and he shipped these chilled beefs up through Canada, up through New England, and down into Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And he was ruthless. Swift and Armour were both ruthless. And the fact is, so let's say a local butcher, and the local butcher said, "Well, this is embalmed beef. This is no good. This is terrible. This is spoiled." Um, Swift said, "Well, okay, if you won't sell my meat, I'll open up my own stores and sell them. And if you sell your meat at 10 cents a pound, I'll sell it for 9 cents. And you sell it 9 cents, I'll sell it for 7 cents. And if you sell it at 7 cents, I'll sell it for a nickel a pound until you're out of business or until you take my beef." And so he soon dominated the East Coast markets. Then they did the same thing on the West Coast markets, where you would think all the way on the West Coast they would set up meat packing houses, and et cetera, and ship. So the Union stockyards actually brought in livestock from all over the 48 states, what eventually would be the 48 states. There were in 48 states in 1865, but all over the territories of the United States, they brought cattle in. This was part of a revolution that took part after the defeat of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Suddenly, Texas cattle, you know, could be driven north, and there were railheads that appeared in various places in Oklahoma, Missouri, etc. And then they would ship them to Chicago to this stockyard.
Now,
Um, even when I was there, and I worked there as a livestock handler in 1969, and then as a guard in 70 and 71. Even when I was there, it was the best fine cattle market in the country. We would get sometimes as much as 13,000 head of livestock in an evening. Cattle, the hog market had already closed by 1970. But it really was sort of the Wall Street of meat, if you can take
yeah.
understand the metaphor. So it set the price across the country.
Wow. And so, real quick, I think Swift and Armor lasted. I mean, I believe technically the remnants are still around to this day, but they've been sold a few times in
Right.
2007 specifically. Whether they are broken apart or they still continued to be one company, I'm not sure, but they're still around, right? What they did back then has impacted the meat world still to this day.
Sure, and it's been improved upon in many ways as far as the production of meat. I would say that the closing of the big central markets like Chicago, East St. Louis, Illinois, Kansas City, Omaha, all the big markets, all the big stockyards are closed and gone. That I think has hurt family farmers a lot, and they were sort of tricked into going away from these markets and selling direct to the meat packers,
Hmm.
with the promise that the Chicago price would always be there for them, that they would always honor the Chicago price. Once the Chicago stockyards closed because there was no longer enough livestock to maintain it, um, then the big meat packers had and now of course meat packers like Smithfield that run their own super farms where they raise hundreds of thousands of hogs. Smithfield, like I believe, slaughters over 100,000 hogs a day in the Carolinas and Virginia, and and they're non-union places, so the labor is cheap, um, and they have put a lot of family farms out of work.
So in the movie Patch Adams, I remember watching it and was kind of blown away that there was this big party for the meat packers, right? The union that was formed. I mean, they became an extremely powerful union from what I gathered. So you said in this summary, 50,000 workers at one time were working at the highest level, or whenever it was the craziest, I think early 1900s, 50,000 people in this one stockyard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And so
and the packing houses and the adjacent packing houses as well.
And
Yeah.
so this is right around you're talking about I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so we have quite a big history with the steel industry and the
Right.
unions that were formed there and the battle between the workers and the owners. This is right around the same time. So very dangerous conditions, I believe, working extremely wild hours, and therefore a union was formed, creating one of the largest unions in the United States at the time, I think.
Right. Well, I mean, there were various attempts to form unions. The first strike in the stockyard was 1869, just 4 years after it was founded. And then there were strikes in 1877, 1886, 1894, 1901, 1904. Um, the the final successful push for the stockyard meatpacking unions were At the same time, the United Steelworkers were founded in the 1930s, were in the 1930s during the Great Depression and the New Deal. And that union became very powerful. Uh, but within 20 years after their founding, most of the big meat packers had already began to leave Chicago. And many of them moved. For instance, Wilson and Company, when it closed its huge plant, they had about 6,000 people working for it. It closed it like overnight, and they opened a plant in Oklahoma, which was a non-union state, with anti-union laws. So the, many of these meat packers actually fled the big cities and fled those places where the unions were strong. Um, Today, however, Chicago is still a they, there's only one slaughterhouse left in Chicago. It's a small operation, still in the Union Stockyard, park packing. Um, but there are many what they call meat purveyors. That is, that they buy their slaughtered animals, they bring them into Chicago, and then they cut them up and sell them as pork chops or whatever, lamb chops. There are still quite a few of those in the Chicago area. When I was writing the book, I think there was still 100 in the area, but not in the Union Stockyard itself.
Hmm. And so the rise was based off of basically ingenuity of a couple entrepreneurs
Mhm.
combined with the aspect of new technology, once again, trains and frozen cars and whatnot. And then
Right.
obviously like the conveyor belts and being able to automate some of that. What was the cause of the fall then? Was it just because of competition and
No.
maybe nowadays not many people were maybe the vegan push? So what caused it to start to decline?
Well, what happened for the stock now? So let me make perfectly clear that the Union Stockyard was the marketplace. This is where animals were sold. Adjacent to it were the meat packing houses. That's where animals were slaughtered and packaged. And not only animals, they made soap, they made all kinds of things
Uh,
there. But when those big meat packers began to leave, they began to leave for a very specific reason. One is the introduction of the truck rather than the railroad. So railroads tend to center industry because they're permanent structures. You
yeah.
can't pick up railroad lines and move them every 2 days. But with the development of the interstate highway system, with the development of trucks that could go to a farm and pick up animals and take them straight to the meat packing houses and so forth, that began to um, disintegrate this old process and began to how can I put it in other places all over the country. So you get more slaughtering near farms in Iowa, southern Illinois, Wisconsin, all over the place, instead of having it brought together sort of in one center like Chicago or Kansas City or Omaha. So that was important. The other thing important was the idea of direct buying. So if you were a meat packer, what you do is you go to a small farmer and say, "Look, Farmer Jones, you've got 100 head of cattle here. You want to send them to Chicago, you can. But remember, at Chicago, you pay a commission. You have to pay to transport them there. Uh, you often go with your animals, drive along with your animals because you want to make sure you get the right price because you don't trust anybody, right? So here I am, Armour and Company. I'm going to send a truck to get your animals, pick them up. There's no transportation cost for you. There's no commission to be paid. You get exactly what you would have gotten at Chicago. You make more money, you less work. How about that? Isn't that a great deal? Of course, then once the livestock market closes, then they're at the command of the meat packers. So it's kind of interesting, and I think the loss of those markets, like I said, killed off a lot of small family farms. And to an extent, I mean, and remember the Drover's Journal, which was perhaps the most influential industry newspaper. It came out every day in Chicago, warned farmers about this. They said, you're cutting your own throats by selling direct to the meat packers, but it's up to you. And then eventually the stockyard closed. So it was a real quick decline after World War II. World War II was so up to 1933, there had never been fewer than 13 million head of livestock unloaded at the Chicago Union Stockyard. After that, it never reached it again. It did hit 10 million during World War II, but then after World War II, it declined very quickly. Remember, once again, you've got the truck, you've got direct buying, You've got changes in the way marketing is done in rural areas. You've got the telephone. Telephone's a big thing. You know, people pick up the phone and say, "Well, this is what we'll give you for your livestock. What do you think? You're going to ship to Chicago, or are you going to let me send a truck down to pick you up?" You know, and now computers, right? So here we are talking in a media that when I was a boy we couldn't even imagine, except for like Buck Rogers or something. But here we are talking together, and this is the same with farmers. They use, computers just like everybody else. So you've seen this tremendous technological change that created the Union Stockyard, and then technological change that brought its decline.
Jeez. Yeah, it completely changed the food system, and like you said, it introduced people to certain types of meat possibly for the very first time in their lives. So individuals were able to carry people or carry animals to Chicago, and then Chicago pretty much puts it everywhere in the country if there's a train system nearby. Then trucks come into play, and then like you said, the it starts to decline right around, you said, after the 40s. Your family has been loyal to this company. So, what was it like seeing it pretty much diminish? Was it just devastating to the city of
I'm
Chicago and then even some families like yours?
Yeah. Well, my family had been in meatpacking until the 1940s, and after World War II, the boys came back. My father came back, and my uncles came back, and they didn't want to work sticking pigs anymore. So they went to what they called clean industries. You know, they went to work at places like Western Electric, which are now gone, also, um, and other kinds of industries. And so, but they stayed in the neighborhood. The neighborhood still maintained their sort of white working class presence for the longest time, with the growth of the mixed Mexican community and the growth of the African American community. So by 1958, 80% of the meatpacking workers in Chicago were people of color. Well, the whites had basically left the industry,
Wow.
except for top management jobs, things like that. Um, they moved down to what they called, like I say, cleaner industries. There was also a sort of feeling that this was not these were not prestigious jobs, right? I mean, you're standing in blood up to your ankles all day and pushing meat around. When I went to work there as a student as a student at the University of Illinois at Chicago, I went to work there at nights first as a livestock handler. I didn't even know the stockyards were still there. I was roaming around. Uh, I had worked actually in a steel mill, and I did not like the job. It was not a very good job, and though it paid well. And I quit. It was a summer job, and I walked through the old packing house district, and it looked like London bombed out after the war. These huge industrial buildings just abandoned, holes in the walls, things like that. And I was walking across the stockyards with the idea that I'd get to the bus on Halsted Street and then go up to the university and take a look at what they had for jobs. And I came across the livestock market. There it was. I said, "Wow, what the hell is this?" And I went in and I got a job that night. I was working in the hog house. Um, for me, it was a really interesting place to work. But I worked outside. I worked with the animals, rather than slaughtering. I hadn't seen a slaughter until I wrote this book. I had a friend whose family owned a meatpacking house, one of the few slaughterhouses left in Chicago at the time. It's now closed. Franco Chiapetti. And Franco said, "Sure, you want to see a slaughter? My uncle will take you through." So I went to see the slaughter, and I was reluctant at first,
Yeah.
uh,
I can
and
understand why. I don't want to see it.
yeah,
I
and
love meat. I love chicken. I love burgers.
sure.
I'm afraid if I watch one of these, I
Mm-hmm.
will not want to eat it anymore. So I've heard of individuals going through that. So you probably felt the same way, huh?
Yeah, I did, and here I had worked in the industry as outside. Once again, we didn't slaughter; we sold the animals. But I went to see the slaughter. Felt I had to do that if I was going to write this book, and it was a sheep slaughterhouse, and it worked. It was so fast, Matt, so fast, uh, and so laid out that you realize it was just a job. I saw it from the throat being slit all the way to get into the cooler, and it was just the line went so quickly, and people worked so fast. And most of the people in the slaughterhouse were from Michoacan in Mexico. the industry always had attracted immigrants, whether those immigrants were from Ireland or Poland or Germany or Mexico, or from the rural South, African Americans. And it always attracted those kinds of people. The latest wave were people from Mexico, from Michoacan, and they were all working there, and it was going very fast. Unfortunately, that plant is now gone. Those 220 jobs or whatever it was there are now gone as well. In a neighborhood that's seeing some gentrification. Nobody really wants a meatpacking plant next to their 40, 100, $300,000 townhouse. So a lot of these industries have closed up and moved out. Um, but to see it, one began to realize how quickly um, it happened. And everybody had one little job to do. One person went to pull this apart, one person pulled that out, one person cut this, and so it just went really quickly by. And then they gave me a box full of lamb chops, and I went home. And and I'm coming in the house. Of course, I'd been standing in blood, right? My dog went crazy. It was like I had brought the dog home something really important.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was interesting to see it, and it gave me a perspective on the book that I hadn't had before.
So was it number one, messy, number two, scary, and number three, did it change your perspective on eating meat?
Um, I'll start with eating meat. No, it has not changed my perspective on eating meat. In
Yeah.
fact, that box of lamb chops were excellent that they
Yeah.
gave me.
I believe God put animals on the planet for that reason. So whenever people say you shouldn't eat it because of new technology, I'm like, you just don't do that. These
Yeah,
animals,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, I just look at deer. I see hunting. I could never kill a deer, but I see the benefit. I mean, I could probably do it if I need to, especially if I'm in survival mode. But I see it. I'm like, it's a necessity. You have to kill. Otherwise, it would be so much overpopulation. There'd be getting hit by cars. It'd be a mess everywhere. So I think it's essential, and that's the way I look at it. So
well, it's interesting. It did not affect me. I'll tell you, I didn't eat pork for a while after working in the hog house. That was a little much for me, but I do now. Um, so now, was it scary? I thought it would be, but no, it wasn't. It was very clean. It went very quickly. There were meat inspectors all over the place. Um, but there was blood on the floor. I mean, because you're slaughtering animals, and they're going down into drains. Um, and that blood is used for all kinds of things, for fertilizer, etc., for medicines, etc.
wow,
Um, Actually, at the Union stockyards, you used to be able to go across the street on Halsted. So the stockyards were west of Halsted, so you could go out on Halsted and buy buttons made out of blood from animals slaughtered in the stockyards. So you could actually buy little buttons to put on your shirt made out of blood from the steers or the hogs at one point. They used everything but the squeal. And Armour said if he could package the squeal and somebody would buy it, he'd do that too.
that is
So
crazy.
it was the epitome of American capitalism: is use everything,
Oh
make
my
a buck
God,
out of all of it. Really
man.
interesting. And there are parallels to the steel industry. Chicago became a major steel producing center as well in the Chicago Gary area, and the unions rose at the same time there, and they were connected with each other even during World War I when there were drives. So these two industries really made places like Chicago important industrial centers.
Well, when it comes to the regulations that came from it, I mean, it's unbelievable. From what I'm reading, it seems like the passage of the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So, like, a lot of regulations were put in place. And so I would think even the FDA is involved, or I don't know how this is all done, but it seems like this was a crucial piece to all the regulations that are involved with just meat in general to this day because of how much food was going through there and maybe people getting sick and almost I'm assuming there was a lot of craziness early on before they had the regulations which caused all that. So anything you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, there was not much regulation before 1906. Teddy Roosevelt, he was with the Rough Riders during the Spanish American War. He always believed that many of the deaths caused during the Spanish American War were by rancid meat that was shipped out of Chicago. So he was looking for a way to deal with this industry. This progressive movement is the sort of beginning of a period of regulation, of not only meat, but pure food and drugs and other kinds of acts. Um, and Upton Sinclair wrote the book The Jungle, which was, in my view, largely an exaggeration based on the myths and the stories of 50, 60 years at the stockyards. But it had a real impact on the public, and it had an impact on Roosevelt. He now had a tool that he could use to push rules to Congress to regulate
Got it.
this industry. So this was really an important ad. When Upton Sinclair's book comes out, 1906, you begin to see Congress sort of shifting away from the idea of no regulation to regulation. And the meatpacking industry had been um, investigated many times in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s by the federal government, especially over the use of the idea of monopoly or oligopoly, where several companies come together to control a marketplace. And they were definitely guilty of this. Armour, Swift, Nelson Morris, S&S Meatpacking. They were definitely guilty of manipulating the market. Um, Remember, these guys were out to make a profit. They weren't
Yeah.
out to be
Ruthless.
weren't
They
out to be
sound ruthless.
heroes or good citizens. They were out to make a profit, and they made a zillion bucks. I mean, they really made a tremendous amount of money on this. And some of them were rather strange characters. These early guys. I mean, Swift, had been a butcher back in Massachusetts, and he became a livestock uh, purchaser. He would go out and buy livestock, and he moved to Chicago and then opened his own plant. Uh, and he lived right next to the stockyard. His wife finally had to make him move, finally forced him to move because she couldn't take the smell. And so he moved to an upper class neighborhood along the lakefront, to the Hyde Park Kenwood area. Nelson Morris was this little immigrant, small man, who had grown up in the meatpacking business in Germany. He was a German Jew. Um, his name, I forget what his name was originally, but he worked for a meatpacker named Nelson, and so they called him Nelson's Morris. And so he just changed his name to Nelson Morris later on, and opened up one of the biggest meatpacking companies in the world. And by the way, there was a fire in the stockyards, um, and at Nelson Morris plant, which killed more firemen than any place else in the country until 9/11. 21 firemen died when the meatpacking house just collapsed on them in 19, gosh, losing it now, May, I think about 1915 or so. And it fell on these firemen. They died. And that was the largest loss of first responders until 9/11. So the
Wow.
stockyard, and there were fires in the stockyards all the time. I mean, all the time. In 1934, a fire broke out in the Chicago stockyards that uh, basically took out the entire cattle division uh, and parts of the sheep division and burned down buildings. In fact, the fire was so intense that it jumped Halsted Street and started burning the neighborhood down just to the east of the stockyards. Um, and that fire was finally put out. There's actually a kind of funny story about this. Um, Across on Halsted Street were a series of taverns, that would serve the workers as they came out, and the livestock men who came out, and many of the farmers. And There was one tavern there on about 40th and Halsted. The fire was raging, and the tavern just opened its doors and gave free beer out to the firemen. And by God, that tavern did not burn down. Firemen,
They protected that. Oh,
they
wow.
protected that tavern. Yeah. So there's kind of interesting stories about. Well, fires are weird things, Anyway, they burn weird ways, but that fire wiped out the cattle division, much of the sheep division. It did not burn down the packing houses. And the next day, that was about the next day for the livestock market. The stockyard put up temporary pens and unloaded cattle and hogs and sheep, and
No
it
pause. Just kept going.
just kept going. It never closed. We were open every day uh, until August 1st, 1971, which was the first non-market day, and from 1865 on. So, no matter what happened, it was always open. And, another interesting historical connection is the people who organized the Union Stockyard and Transit Company, the livestock market, were all friends of Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, there was a huge bust of Abraham Lincoln in front of the Exchange Building until the day it was knocked down. Um, so they had all been friends of Lincoln. And of course, it was called the Union Stockyard, which had double meaning in 1865, right?
Yeah.
It had just been fought for the Union, but it was supposedly the uniting of about six small stockyards in Chicago into one. So it had a sort of a double meaning for people in 1865. So there's all kinds of little interesting historical connections here.
Last question I have for you is, what can we learn from this? I mean, it seems like there was a couple ruthless entrepreneurs who made very wise decisions. They took advantage of opportunity. They created demand, right, by being really smart and maybe even creating that monopoly. But I don't know. Is there anything else we can take from it?
Well, I think what we have to think about is how technology changes the way we live our lives every day. Americans didn't eat meat all the time. We are today one of the biggest meat eater countries in the world. And it actually comes out of an Anglo-Saxon tradition. You know, but way technology changed, made meat more affordable, cheaper, and today we still have cheap meat. You we talk about chicken. Chicken was expensive in the 1920s. It was rarely eaten. Places like Tyson came along, mass produced it. Suddenly, the price of chicken came down. Now, chicken is a cheap meat, right?
Yeah.
Comparatively. So, technology, what we have to be aware of is how technology changes not only the way we eat or we work, but the way we live. And like I say, here we are talking in this what when I was a kid would have been sort of a Buck Rogers method of seeing each other,
The dream. Yeah.
and now
Jetson like.
yeah, now it's an everyday occurrence. I do several Zooms a week, um, and so technology has changed the way we. I mean, lately, right? The stay-at-home right worker who doesn't go downtown anymore to work in an office. He works at least 3 days at home, or she works at least 3 days at home. That has changed. It's had a tremendous impact on the downtowns in Chicago, New York, and across the country. Now you've got empty office buildings because you don't need offices because everybody's on Zoom. So technology really changes the way we interact with each other.
Yeah. You
And
can
we'll
run from it.
continue.
You
Yeah,
can run from it, but it's going to get you. There's
yeah,
no doubt about it.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think that anybody who's trying to run from AI is fooling themselves. So this technology that is in our existence right now, but it's going to get crazier and crazier. So learn to adopt it, use it to your advantage. Don't be
Right,
used by it is probably the best way to put it.
right,
So
right, yeah, absolutely.
guys, the book, I mean, I just love these type of stories because I don't talk about this with everybody. Slaughterhouse, Chicago's Union Stockyard and the World It Made. Dominic Pasiga, it is an honor to talk with you. You're a great storyteller. I'm sure you've heard that before.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
And is there a way for people to get in touch with you? Is it just through LinkedIn, or is any website do you recommend?
I you can email me, I suppose. Uh, Lowercase d pacyga at ameritech.net. My books are available from the University of Chicago Press, and of course through Amazon and the usual booksellers. And yeah, I have my webpage at the University of Chicago Press is probably the easiest way to go.
Cool. Dominic Pasiga. Guys, check out the book. If you love true stories like me, you would absolutely love it. So, Dominic, thank you again. And remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million